Technology tells a quieter story. Growth also depends on restoration, on pause, on recovery deep enough for the nervous system to reorganize itself. And maybe this is why so many chronically exhausted people feel emotionally stuck. Not because they lack effort, but because their brain has been trying to survive without enough restoration for far too long. The modern world praises stimulation endlessly, but the sleeping brain still asks for something ancient: darkness, safety, stillness, time long enough to heal what waking life continuously interrupts. Researchers studying elite performance eventually arrived at a conclusion that sounds almost counterintuitive in a culture obsessed with constant productivity. Training does not fully end when practice stops. Part of training continues during sleep. The body may leave the gym. The musician may stop rehearsing. The student may close the book. But the brain continues refining what was learned long after conscious effort ends. And perhaps this changes the meaning of rest entirely. Because rest is not always the absence of progress. Sometimes, rest is where progress becomes biologically possible. This appears especially true in language learning. Researchers have repeatedly found that words studied shortly before sleep are often remembered more effectively than words studied earlier in the day and followed by many waking hours. And the difference cannot be explained only by reduced distraction. Something active seems to happen overnight. The sleeping brain appears to strengthen newly formed sound-meaning associations during early stages of sleep, especially during the deep, slow-wave periods that dominate the first half of the night, as though the brain uses those quieter hours to stabilize fragile new connections before daily stimulation can weaken them. And emotionally, this may reflect something larger about the human mind. The brain does not thrive under endless input. It requires intervals of stillness to fully absorb experience. Modern life rarely allows this. People move constantly from one demand to the next, one notification to another, one source of stimulation replacing the last. But the nervous system was not designed for perpetual intake without integration. Sleep creates that missing interval, a protected neurological space where experience can settle deeply enough to become understanding. And perhaps nowhere is this more fascinating than in what scientists call insight sleep. There are moments when people struggle intensely with a problem while awake, only to discover clarity after sleeping. A solution suddenly appears. A pattern becomes obvious. An answer arrives with surprising ease the next morning. Researchers studying this phenomenon found that participants who slept between learning sessions were dramatically more likely to discover hidden solutions to complex problems compared to those who remained awake. the sleeping brain appeared capable of reorganizing information in ways the waking brain could not easily achieve. And maybe this explains something many exhausted people quietly experience. The harder the mind forces itself, sometimes the narrower it becomes. Under stress, the brain tends to fixate, repeat, over-control. But during sleep, rigid thought patterns loosen. The brain becomes more associative, more flexible, more capable of unexpected connections. Some forms of understanding seem to require surrender before they can emerge. Not more pressure, not more forcing, but space, stillness, enough quiet for deeper patterns to surface naturally. And perhaps emotional healing works this way too. Many people spend years trying to think themselves out of anxiety, trying to intellectually solve emotional exhaustion, trying to force peace through effort. But the nervous system does not always heal through conscious control alone. Sometimes healing requires conditions the brain can only fully enter during deep rest. Safety, reduced stimulation, biological calm, time long enough for defensive patterns to soften. This is one reason sleep profoundly influences emotional resilience. A rested brain processes differently from an exhausted one. Stress feels less catastrophic. Attention broadens. Emotional regulation strengthens. Hope becomes easier to access. And this has important implications for learning itself. Researchers have long known that spaced repetition, reviewing information gradually over time, improves memory far more effectively than cramming. But sleep appears to amplify this effect dramatically. When periods of learning are separated by nights of sleep, long-term retention improves more than when the same amount of time passes entirely awake. Sleep acts almost like a reset point for the nervous system, strengthening what was learned, clearing interference, preparing the brain for deeper integration during the next exposure. Which means sleep is not merely a pause between learning sessions. It is part of the learning process itself, an active biological partner in adaptation. And perhaps this idea extends far beyond memory, because human beings are not only learning facts every day, they are learning emotional expectations, stress patterns, relationship patterns, ways of responding to uncertainty, ways of carrying fear, ways of anticipating danger. The nervous system is constantly learning from experience, and every night, the brain attempts to organize what it has absorbed, which may explain why periods of chronic stress feel so physically consuming. The brain is not only managing today's burden, it is carrying unresolved activation from many previous days as well, trying to process emotional overload with insufficient recovery time. And after a while, exhaustion stops feeling temporary. It begins feeling like identity. But perhaps one of the quietest forms of hope inside sleep research is this: the brain remains adaptable far longer than people assume. Even tired brains continue trying to regulate, trying to reorganize, trying to move toward equilibrium whenever enough rest becomes available. Even after years of stress, even after burnout, even after emotional exhaustion, the nervous system still remembers the direction of healing. And maybe tonight, as you listen in darkness, your own breathing has already softened slightly without you noticing. Your muscles may have released tension you were unconsciously holding. Your thoughts may already be moving more slowly than they were a little while ago, not because you force them to, but because the brain naturally shifts when it begins sensing safety. So for a moment, simply notice your body, the quiet weight of your breathing, the surface beneath you supporting your muscles, the small sensations moving gently across your skin, your heartbeat continuing faithfully in the background, trillions of cells carrying out invisible work without asking for your attention. And somewhere inside all of that quiet biological intelligence, your brain is still trying to help you heal, even now, even in darkness, even while you rest. Your body is not a machine struggling alone in darkness. It is an ecosystem, complex, adaptive, constantly regulating itself beneath awareness, your heart adjusting rhythm moment by moment, your lungs exchanging oxygen without instruction, hormones rising and falling in carefully timed cycles, immune cells communicating silently through chemical signals, and your brain sorting through an entire day of emotional and sensory experience while you rest. Much of this happens automatically, quietly, without demanding your attention. And perhaps there is something deeply comforting in remembering that healing does not always require conscious control. Sometimes the body already knows what to do when it is finally given enough stillness. And as the sleeping brain continues its work through the night, it becomes increasingly selective about what it preserves. Not every experience receives equal priority. Not every thought survives unchanged until morning. The brain appears to apply something like an emotional relevance filter while you sleep. Certain memories become strengthened, others fade gradually into the background, and researchers believe one reason for this may involve dopamine, one of the brain's key signaling chemicals related to reward, novelty, motivation, and emotional significance. When an experience feels emotionally important, surprising, deeply stressful, or personally meaningful, dopamine activity may help tag that experience for stronger overnight processing, almost like the brain quietly marking certain moments with invisible importance. Pay attention to this. Keep this. This mattered. And emotionally, human beings understand this intuitively. People rarely remember every ordinary day equally. The brain preserves moments tied to emotion, moments of fear, relief, connection, humiliation, wonder, loss. Because memory is not simply a recording system. It is part of how the nervous system learns what matters for survival and identity. And perhaps this is why emotionally exhausted people often struggle so deeply at night. Their brains are trying to process too many emotionally tagged experiences at once. Too much unresolved stimulation, too many unfinished stress signals. The nervous system keeps carrying emotional weight forward because it has not yet had enough safety to fully process it. And the brain organizes new information most efficiently when it can connect it to something already familiar. Researchers refer to these existing mental frameworks as schemas, internal structures of understanding built gradually over years of experience. When new information fits into an existing schema, the brain can consolidate it much faster. An expert musician learns new music more easily than a beginner. A fluent speaker learns related vocabulary faster than someone hearing the language for the first time. The brain already has pathways waiting, structures ready to receive the new material. And perhaps emotional life works similarly. People process new experiences through the frameworks their nervous systems already know. Someone who has lived through chronic stress may unconsciously expect danger. Someone who has experienced rejection may become highly sensitive to emotional distance. The brain learns patterns not only intellectually, but emotionally. And during sleep, those patterns continue being reinforced, reorganized, and updated. Because sleep does not simply preserve experience exactly as it happened, the brain edits memory, not dishonestly, not maliciously, but adaptively. Throughout the night, memories are reorganized, peripheral details fade, core emotional themes remain stronger. New information becomes integrated into existing understanding. In some ways, what you remember after sleep is not a perfect recording, but a refined interpretation shaped by what your brain considered most meaningful. And perhaps this explains why certain memories change emotionally over time. The brain keeps revisiting them, reframing them, softening some edges while preserving others. Human memory is not static, it is alive, continually rewritten by sleep, emotion, context, and meaning. And one of the most fascinating places researchers observe this transformation is in creativity. People who sleep between attempts at solving difficult problems often discover more flexible, original solutions afterward. The sleeping brain seems unusually capable of forming distant associations between ideas, especially during REM sleep. During this stage, brain regions communicate in looser, more imaginative ways than they typically do during focused waking thought. Connections emerge that the analytical mind might normally suppress. Unexpected patterns appear, new interpretations surface, and perhaps this is why dreams often feel emotionally strange, yet strangely insightful at the same time. The dreaming brain is less constrained by rigid logic. It explores possibilities, symbolism, association, meaning. Some researchers even believe creativity itself may depend partly on the brain's ability to loosen conscious control during sleep, to temporarily release the rigid structure of waking thought long enough for deeper connections to emerge naturally. And remarkably, this processing may begin almost immediately after consciousness starts fading. Scientists studying the transition between wakefulness and sleep, a state known as hypnagogia, discovered that even very early moments of drifting sleep can support memory consolidation. The threshold itself matters. Those fragile drifting moments when thoughts become softer, images blur, and awareness begins loosening its grip. The brain does not suddenly switch off. It gradually changes mode, almost like descending slowly beneath the surface of water. And this transition zone appears far more neurologically active than people once believed. Perhaps this is one reason so many people experience emotionally vivid thoughts while drifting towards sleep. The brain has already started shifting into a different style of processing, less rigid, less externally focused, more associative, more inward. And as the night continues, the architecture of sleep changes in carefully organized patterns. Earlier portions of the night contain more deep, slow wave sleep, the kind strongly associated with physical restoration, factual memory consolidation, and nervous system recovery. Later portions contain increasingly larger amounts of REM sleep, the stage linked more closely to emotional regulation, dreaming, creativity, and psychological integration. Which means losing the final hours of sleep may affect the brain differently than people realize. Sleeping 6 hours instead of 8 does not simply reduce rest evenly. It often cuts disproportionately into REM-rich sleep toward morning, the very stages most connected to emotional recalibration and psychological recovery. And perhaps this helps explain why people under chronic stress often wake feeling emotionally unsteady, even after technically sleeping. The body may have rested partially, but the brain may not have completed all of its overnight
emotional processing, which is why deep healing sleep is not only about duration, it is about allowing the nervous system enough uninterrupted time to move through its full biological rhythm of restoration. The brain has a sequence, a process, a hidden nighttime choreography developed over millions of years. And every night, it continues trying to guide exhausted human beings gently back toward balance. And this may be one reason the final hours of sleep are so emotionally important, especially for people carrying stress, anxiety, grief, or unresolved mental tension. The later portions of the night contain more REM sleep, the stage most closely associated with emotional integration, creativity, and psychological flexibility, which means cutting sleep short may interrupt some of the brain's most emotionally restorative work. Many people sacrifice the final hours of sleep, believing they have already rested enough. But biologically, the brain may still be in the middle of processing emotional information, still reorganizing, still recalibrating, still trying to soften the emotional intensity accumulated during waking life. And throughout this process, the brain does something remarkable. It does not isolate new memories from old ones. Instead, it integrates them. Every new experience becomes woven into vast networks of existing knowledge, emotion, association, and identity. The sleeping brain constantly asks, how does this fit into everything else I already know? And during sleep, those connections strengthen. A new idea links itself to older memories. A recent emotional experience reshapes previous interpretations. A difficult conversation becomes integrated into a broader understanding of a relationship. By morning, the brain has subtly reorganized the internal map, which is why people sometimes wake with a feeling that something has changed, even if they cannot fully explain what changed. The experience itself is no longer isolated. It has become contextualized, connected, integrated into a larger emotional framework. And perhaps this is one reason sleep can improve performance without additional practice. The brain spent the night building smoother associative pathways, strengthening connections, reducing friction. When you wake, you are not accessing exactly the same brain state you had before sleeping. You are returning to a brain that has been quietly edited overnight. And nowhere is this replay process more visible than in spatial memory. Researchers studying navigation found that brain cells involved in mapping physical space reactivate during deep sleep after learning tasks. In experiments using mazes and navigation challenges, the sleeping brain repeatedly replayed patterns associated with the paths participants had traveled earlier in the day, sometimes replaying them at astonishing speed, almost like fast-forwarding through experience repeatedly throughout the night. The brain was rehearsing the journey, strengthening the internal map, learning where it had been. And emotionally, human beings may do something similar. The mind revisits emotional terrain repeatedly during sleep. Fear, loss, connection, conflict, moments of relief, moments of shame. The sleeping brain keeps retracing emotional pathways, trying to understand how to navigate them more effectively in the future. And all of this depends on an extraordinarily delicate balance between different neurochemical systems. One important player is acetylcholine, a neurotransmitter deeply involved in attention, learning, and memory formation. During waking life, acetylcholine levels remain relatively high. This supports the rapid encoding of new experiences. The brain stays alert to incoming information, ready to absorb, ready to react. But during deep, slow-wave sleep, acetylcholine levels drop dramatically, and this shift appears crucial because lowering acetylcholine may temporarily release the brain from constant incoming stimulation, allowing it to consolidate and stabilize what was already learned, almost like closing the front door long enough to finally organize the crowded room inside. The brain cannot endlessly absorb new information while simultaneously integrating old information with maximum efficiency. So biology separates these tasks rhythmically. Wakefulness emphasizes acquisition. Sleep emphasizes consolidation. And perhaps modern life disrupts this balance more than ever before. Many people remain neurologically overstimulated until the very moment they attempt sleep. Endless scrolling, notifications, mental pressure, emotional activation. The brain stays stuck in intake mode, constantly encoding, rarely fully transitioning into deeper restoration. And over time, this imbalance accumulates because poor sleep affects more than one single night. It changes what happens the next day as well. Researchers have repeatedly shown that sleep deprivation weakens the brain's ability not only to consolidate previous memories, but also to form new ones afterward. An exhausted brain struggles to properly encode experience. Attention becomes fragmented, learning weakens, emotional regulation deteriorates, and perhaps most dangerously, many sleep-deprived people underestimate the extent of their impairment. The tired brain often adapts gradually enough that exhaustion starts feeling normal. People continue functioning outwardly while their nervous system quietly accumulates strain. This creates a compounding cycle. Poor sleep weakens emotional resilience. Reduced resilience increases stress. Increased stress disrupts sleep further. And over time, the nervous system begins living in a near constant state of low-level threat activation, which may explain why chronically exhausted people often become more emotionally sensitive over time, especially socially. REM sleep appears deeply connected to emotional interpretation and social understanding. Studies show that people deprived specifically of REM sleep become less accurate at reading emotional expressions in others. Neutral faces begin appearing more threatening. Ambiguous emotions feel more negative. The brain loses some of its ability to interpret emotional nuance calmly. And perhaps this reveals something profoundly important. Sleep helps human beings maintain emotional perspective. Without enough restorative sleep, the nervous system gradually shifts toward defensive interpretation, toward vigilance, toward threat detection, toward survival mode, which means healthy sleep may not only support memory, but compassion, patience, emotional balance, the ability to feel safe enough around other people. And maybe this explains why emotionally exhausted individuals often describe feeling disconnected from themselves and others after long periods of poor sleep. The nervous system becomes too overloaded to interpret the world gently. Everything begins feeling sharper, heavier, more emotionally demanding. But when sleep improves, something often changes quietly. Not all at once, but gradually. The brain regains flexibility. Emotional interpretation softens. The mind becomes less rigid, and difficult things that felt impossible the night before suddenly seem slightly more manageable in the morning. Musicians experience this. Athletes experience this. Writers, scientists, mathematicians, people struggling emotionally experience it too. A problem that felt hopeless late at night may feel survivable after rest. Not because reality changed completely, but because the brain changed state. And perhaps this is one of the deepest truths hidden inside sleep science. The exhausted mind and the rested mind do not experience life the same way. Sleep changes perception itself, which means recovery is not weakness. It is part of how human beings remain psychologically capable of carrying their lives at all. And perhaps this is why some answers seem to arrive only after sleep, not during effort, not while straining to force clarity, but later, quietly, after the conscious mind has loosened its grip. So many people have experienced this without fully understanding it. A problem feels impossible late at night. Thoughts circle endlessly. Nothing makes sense. And then somehow, by morning, the same problem feels different. Not always solved completely, but softened, organized, more understandable than before. Researchers increasingly believe this is not imagination. The sleeping brain continues problem solving beneath awareness, reorganizing information, testing associations, searching for patterns beyond the reach of a waking thought. And perhaps this reveals something important about the nervous system itself. Clarity is not always produced through more pressure. Sometimes it emerges through release. The brain appears to work best under conditions of manageable challenge, not chronic threat. A moderate level of stress can actually enhance learning and memory formation. The nervous system becomes alert, focused, responsive. Certain stress chemicals help the brain prioritize important information. But when stress becomes excessive or never fully resolves, the relationship changes completely. High levels of ongoing stress begin fragmenting sleep itself. Deep restorative sleep decreases. The architecture of the night becomes disrupted, and the very systems responsible for emotional regulation and memory consolidation start functioning less effectively. The body's survival systems were designed for temporary danger, not endless activation. And perhaps this is one reason so many people today feel simultaneously exhausted and mentally overstimulated. Their nervous systems never fully exit alert mode, even at night, especially at night. The brain keeps scanning, monitoring, preparing, as though true rest no longer feels entirely safe. And over time, this chronic activation quietly interferes with the brain's natural restorative intelligence. Not because the brain is weak, but because biology prioritizes survival over restoration whenever threat remains unresolved. Still, the sleeping brain continues trying to help. Researchers have even developed experimental systems designed to gently support natural sleep rhythms. Using highly sensitive monitoring technology, scientists can now detect specific brainwave patterns during sleep in real time. In some experiments, soft acoustic pulses are delivered at precisely timed moments to subtly amplify deep, slow wave activity. Early results suggest these interventions may strengthen sleep spindles and improve certain forms of next-to-memory performance. The technology remains experimental, but the implications are extraordinary because they suggest the sleeping brain is not chaotic at all. It is organized, rhythmic, responsive, almost orchestral in its coordination. And perhaps the deeper truth hidden inside all this research is remarkably simple. The brain that sleeps fully learns differently from the brain that does not. Not metaphorically, biologically. Every night changes the nervous system. Every night shapes memory, emotional regulation, attention, resilience, creativity, and perception itself. The sleeping brain is not absent. It is active in ways waking consciousness rarely notices. And perhaps as you listen now, you can notice your own mind beginning to drift slightly differently, thoughts flickering more softly, attention widening and narrowing gently, awareness moving more slowly through the dark. There is something strangely peaceful about recognizing that consciousness itself changes shape. At night, the very mind trying to understand sleep is already beginning to enter it. And perhaps one of the quiet implications of all this research is that sleep quality may influence intelligence far more deeply than most people realize. Not because sleep magically creates knowledge, but because every night either strengthens or weakens the brain's ability to organize experience efficiently. A person who sleeps consistently well across many years may gradually build richer networks of understanding simply because their brain consolidates information more effectively over time. Experience becomes more integrated, connections become stronger, learning compounds, and emotionally, this matters too, because sleep does not only shape what you know, it shapes how experience becomes part of your identity. Researchers studying autobiographical memory found that sleep helps bind new information to personal emotional context. The brain connects learning to lived experience, to feelings, to meaning. And perhaps this is why emotionally meaningful lessons remain with people so much longer than emotionally neutral facts. The brain remembers what feels personally relevant, what touches identity, what resonates emotionally. Knowledge becomes more durable when it becomes part of the self, and this process begins astonishingly early in life. Children's brains appear especially dependent on sleep for learning and generalization. Researchers studying preschool children found that naps significantly improve the ability to retain new words and apply them flexibly in new situations. The sleeping child's brain continues organizing language after waking experience ends, building understanding quietly beneath awareness. And perhaps modern culture underestimates how biologically necessary these pauses truly are, not only for children, but for everyone, because the brain appears fundamentally designed around cycles of intake and restoration, learning and integration, stimulation and recovery. Yet many adults attempt to live permanently in acquisition mode, always consuming, always reacting, always producing, rarely allowing enough true stillness for deeper consolidation to occur. And eventually the nervous system begins showing signs of overload, mental fatigue, forgetfulness, emotional reactivity, difficulty concentrating, a strange sense of disconnection from oneself, not because intelligence disappeared, but because the brain has been functioning without enough restoration for too long. One system especially vulnerable to sleep disruption is working memory, the brain's temporary mental workspace. The system that allows you to hold information actively in mind while thinking, reasoning, planning, or making decisions. Working memory is essential for nearly everything people associate with mental sharpness. Conversation, problem solving, emotional regulation, focus, decision making, and sleep deprivation weakens it quickly, which means exhaustion does not merely make people tired, it changes how much mental and emotional information the brain can effectively carry at once. Life itself becomes cognitively heavier, emotionally heavier, and perhaps this is why deeply exhausted people often describe feeling overwhelmed by things they once handled easily.
The nervous system loses flexibility under chronic fatigue. The brain has fewer available resources for adaptation. But even then, night after night, the sleeping brain continues attempting to restore balance, trying to clear noise, trying to regulate stress, trying to reorganize emotion, trying to heal the very mind listening right now, slowly, quietly, one sleeping cycle at a time. One of the more unsettling discoveries in sleep science is how difficult it can be for exhausted people to recognize their own exhaustion accurately. The brain under sleep deprivation often believes it is functioning better than it truly is. People feel mostly okay, mostly capable, mostly normal. Even while attention weakens, memory slips increase, and emotional regulation quietly deteriorates underneath. Researchers studying working memory, the brain's ability to temporarily hold and manipulate information, have found that even moderate sleep restriction produces measurable declines in cognitive performance. Focus narrows, mental flexibility decreases, the ability to juggle multiple pieces of information becomes harder, and yet many people remain unaware of how impaired they have become. The exhausted brain adapts gradually enough that dysfunction starts feeling familiar, normal, expected. And perhaps this explains why chronic fatigue can become so emotionally confusing. People continue pushing forward because technically they still can, but internally, everything begins requiring more effort than before. Simple decisions feel heavier. Conversations become harder to track. Emotions feel less manageable. Small frustrations feel disproportionately intense. Not because the person became weaker, but because the brain is operating with reduced restorative capacity. And underneath all of this, at the microscopic level, sleep continues shaping the brain physically. Every memory, every habit, every emotional pattern depends on the brain's ability to change itself
through experience. Neuroscientists call this synaptic plasticity, the strengthening and weakening of connections between neurons, the cellular foundation of learning itself. And remarkably, many of the biological processes required for this plasticity become especially active during sleep. Proteins involved in strengthening neural connections are produced in greater amounts during restorative sleep stages. Certain molecular repair processes depend specifically on the slow rhythmic activity of deep sleep, which means sleep is not merely the time when memory consolidation happens. Sleep actively provides part of the biological machinery required to make consolidation possible in the first place. The brain repairs while it reorganizes, builds while it rests, strengthens while consciousness fades. And perhaps this changes how we think about emotional healing too. Because emotional resilience is not simply psychological, it is biological. The ability to regulate emotion depends partly on whether the nervous system has received enough restoration to function properly. An exhausted brain cannot maintain emotional balance indefinitely. No amount of self-criticism changes this. No amount of willpower fully overrides biology forever, and the effects of sleep extend beyond individual memory into social life itself. Researchers have begun exploring how sleep may influence social and cultural learning. The subtle patterns human beings absorb about relationships, emotional communication, group behavior, and social belonging. Many of these patterns are not learned consciously. People absorb them implicitly over years of interaction. How to read facial expressions, how to interpret tone of voice, how to sense emotional tension in a room, how to belong. And early evidence suggests these social patterns may also stabilize and strengthen during sleep, which means the sleeping brain may quietly shape not only what people know, but how they relate to one another emotionally, how safe or threatened they feel around others, how they respond to connection, how they interpret social cues. And perhaps this reveals something deeply human. The person you become tomorrow is partly shaped by how your brain processed today while you slept, not only intellectually, but emotionally, relationally, psychologically. Even the version of yourself that greets the world each morning has been influenced by the invisible work of the night before. Some of the clearest evidence for this comes from studies involving memory disorders. Patients with damage to the hippocampus often lose the ability to form certain kinds of explicit memories. They may forget conversations or events shortly after they happen. And yet many can still improve at physical tasks over time, despite having no conscious memory of practicing them. The body remembers what the conscious mind cannot. Other patients with disrupted REM sleep show different patterns entirely. Emotional learning weakens. Procedural adaptation becomes impaired. The brain loses part of its ability to process emotional and behavioral patterns effectively overnight. These distinctions helped neuroscientists understand something extraordinary. Different parts of sleep contribute different pieces to the construction of the self: memory, emotion, habits, social understanding, creativity, resilience. All of them rely on distinct but interconnected forms of nighttime processing. And perhaps this makes sleep far more mysterious than people once believed. Because when you fall asleep, your conscious awareness recedes, but much of the mind continues working, quietly, continuously. Researchers sometimes describe this as offline processing. The brain continues integrating information even without direct external input. Problems continue being organized. Emotional material continues being sorted. Connections continue forming, as though part of the mind remains awake in a different way, not externally focused, but inwardly active. And perhaps this is why so many people wake with subtle emotional shifts they cannot fully explain. A little calmer, a little clearer, a little less emotionally trapped than they felt the night before. The sleeping brain had continued working silently in the background. And maybe there is comfort in knowing that healing does not always require conscious effort every moment. Sometimes the mind keeps moving gently toward balance, even while you rest, even while you dream, even while you let go for a little while of the exhausting responsibility of holding everything together alone. Because deep inside the sleeping brain, repair is still unfolding, quietly, patiently, one neural rhythm at a time. Even quiet rest during the day appears to help the brain begin processing experience. Moments of stillness, silence, drifting thought, periods when attention relaxes and external demands temporarily soften. Researchers call this offline processing, the brain continuing to organize information even when active effort stops. And many people have felt this intuitively for years. A walk after emotional overwhelm, a quiet drive, sitting silently without forcing thought. Sometimes understanding begins emerging precisely when conscious effort pauses. But sleep appears to be the deepest and most powerful form of offline processing the human brain can enter, because during sleep, multiple restorative systems begin working together at once. Neural replay, memory consolidation, emotional recalibration, hormonal regulation, cellular repair, reduced sensory input, specific rhythmic brainwave patterns impossible to sustain during normal waking consciousness. The sleeping brain enters a unique biological environment that waking rest can approach, but never fully reproduce. And perhaps this explains why modern learning habits so often feel mentally exhausting but emotionally unsatisfying. People absorb enormous amounts of information, but give the brain very little opportunity to integrate it deeply. One of the clearest examples is cramming, trying to force large amounts of learning into one long, exhausting session. The brain may temporarily retain enough information for short-term performance, but without repeated cycles of sleep between exposures, much of that learning remains fragile, unstable, poorly integrated, accessible briefly, then gradually fading. Because the brain seems to learn best through rhythm, exposure, rest, consolidation, repetition, sleep, again and again. Human memory was never designed for endless, uninterrupted intake. It was designed for cycles, and perhaps emotional healing follows the same pattern. People often try to force emotional resolution quickly, to think harder, push harder, solve themselves faster. But the nervous system often changes more slowly than conscious desire. Healing may require repeated experiences of safety over time, repeated nights of rest, repeated cycles of regulation. The brain learns peace gradually too, and perhaps halfway through this journey tonight, something deeper than information has already begun settling into place. The sleeping brain is not passive. It is active in ways far more intelligent and purposeful than most people were ever taught to imagine. Every night, the brain replays experience, reorganizes memory, strengthens some connections, softens others, builds emotional associations, extracts patterns, integrates learning into identity itself. The sleeping brain continues becoming. And perhaps this means something profoundly comforting for exhausted people. Rest is not wasted time. The dark hours are not empty hours. Your nervous system is not doing nothing when you sleep. Much of the most essential work happens there, quietly, invisible from the outside. And maybe as you breathe now, you can notice time feeling slightly softer than before, the night moving more slowly, thoughts becoming less urgent, awareness loosening its grip around the endless need to keep producing, fixing, solving. Because while the world continues moving, your body continues living this one unrepeatable moment, this breath, this quiet, this small pocket of stillness inside a vast universe constantly changing around you. And perhaps there is something healing in simply allowing yourself to exist here for a little while, without needing to earn rest first. Modern neuroscience is beginning to reshape not only how we think about sleep, but how we think about learning itself. Some educators now believe the timing and structure of learning may matter almost as much as the material being taught. Because if sleep strengthens consolidation between learning sessions, then spacing lessons across multiple days may dramatically improve long-term understanding. The architecture matters, the intervals matter, the pauses matter, and perhaps life itself works